Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. On this channel, one thing I am interested in is understanding pollution and how bad pollution is in the modern. We kind of take that for granted today. If you talk to someone, most people will agree modern pollution, the pollution we see around us today, has impacted negatively the environment. But exactly when did that start? When and how bad is the disturbance environmentally modern to its natural or pre-human baseline? Now, that's actually a huge field of study in environmental pollution, environmental health, and getting at that question can be done in a number of different ways. One way we can do that, and I believe is underutilized, is through archaeology. And so today I'm having on the channel Iride Tomažič, and I would want to welcome you to the channel. Thank you for coming on.
Hello,
Iride Tomažič.
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 Yes.
You are the lead author of a new paper. You're the single author of a new paper, Pollution and Contamination, an Archaeological Perspective and Contribution through Animal Teeth. And in this paper, you analyze the metal concentrations in both wild and domesticated animals that are near ancient sites, and you found that you can use them for understanding pollution through time. So, can you first talk about, let's start with the background of the sites. I want to first begin there. So, you're studying animal remains from where on Earth and during what time period, and why is that interesting? So, let's start with that.
Okay. So, first of all, thank you for having me on the channel. So, the time period that I'm studying is from 4,500 to 1,500 BC. And this paper came as a result of my dissertation. So, the pilot is a pilot study of my dissertation. And the idea is that in this time period, in particular in the Southern Carpathian Basin, so this is like Southern Hungary, Western Romania, and Northern Serbia, like this area in particular during this time period didn't have a lot of local metallurgy. So other parts of Europe, we know, especially like Eastern Serbia, has evidence of starting metallurgy and having the first evidence of metallurgy from 5000 BC, but we don't have any local evidence in the area until 4500. So the reason why I started this is because I was really interested of how metallurgy contributes to pollution, because we know that humans constantly interact with the environment. We know that there is a constant like feedback loop with it, and as we know this from environmental studies. But the reason is that it's like metallurgy, it's one of the first technologies that kind of anthropogenically induces heavy metals, so like elements that are technically heavier, into the environment. So this is why I chose this area and time period, because this is where metallurgy starts in this particular area.
Okay, so it's almost spreading. Is it spreading out of Asia Minor, would you say, like through Europe in this area?
So to
Or is it
my
originating there?
So there are numerous theories of how metallurgy basically spread. So there is this idea that like there's a whole like branch of it, right? So the first idea was that metallurgy there were local metallurgists, or like kind of child actually started this in 1930s and 1921 is like when it came out. But he starts with the idea of like traveling craftsmen. So the idea is like we have these metallurgists like in Asia Minor and other places, and they're kind of like traveling throughout Europe, the Balkans and Europe, and they're doing local metallurgy there. Then is the idea of like how it like spreads. Like we have like the problem of like Neolithization, right? When the idea is like we have the first Neolithic settlements, the first time people settle, and they kind of like and that kind of spreads throughout the Balkans and up in Central Europe. And it was like researchers like thought that this was like a similar process happening. But now we have evidence that there is local production that is probably independent from like Asia. But there doesn't mean that there is no interaction. It just means that there are like local developments that come during this time period. Yeah. So
Okay.
there are numerous theories, like when
Yeah.
it starts, where it starts. There are definitely different timelines, of course, but to my understanding of the current literature now, it's that it's local production.
Local
Yeah.
production. Okay, but it's situated at that time period between the Neolithic and like full on metallurgy. So you're kind of straddling that period is why you think it's kind of interesting. So you should
Yeah.
be able to, in theory, have a pre-metallurgy signal and then watch the metallurgy signal grow in your archaeological remains.
Exactly, exactly. And that's the whole idea, right? Because like the period of the Copper Age, it's in archaeology, it's still kind of like debated because in certain parts of Europe you do have evidence of local metallurgy, let's say like around 4500 BC, and other areas like Northern Europe doesn't have that. Right. So like the idea is like, do we actually have a copper? Do we actually have a copper age or we don't? And the current understanding is that some areas do have it, other areas
Hmm.
don't. So some
Hmm.
areas, like for example, the British Isles, go directly from from hunter-gatherer societies to like what we call the Neolithic, right? So like,
Hmm.
and then directly into the Bronze Age. So they don't have that. But once metallurgy explodes, it explodes fully. Other areas like the Balkans, for example, or Central Europe, does have that. And that's why it's interesting because it's like we go from the Neolithic into like some metallurgical production, and then around 4500 you see a spike in it, and then changes in technologies, and then you get to the Bronze Age, and then by that time, looks like everybody does it. Everybody does metallurgy to a certain extent.
Okay. That's interesting about the British Isles. I wasn't aware of that. I know Lakes of Killarney area has some of the oldest copper mines in Western Europe. They're like pre-Roman, but did it kind of just jump straight into goes from Neolithic almost straight into
Yeah.
bronze.
Yeah, because like in certain cases, like for example, there is one mine in eastern Serbia called Rudna Glava, and they find evidence of mining, copper mining, around 5000 BC. So this would go to what is like attached to the late Vincia D period. So like this is the kind of like the cultural complex that lived in that area and that is proposed to have extracted this copper. So we have evidence as early as that in certain areas.
Okay. Now tell me about the two sites you studied. How were they discovered? And maybe tell us something significant about the findings archaeologically in there.
So these two sites, so the sites that I was analyzing in this paper are called Klarafava Hajdova and Kizambor Ujelet. They're both located in the southern part of Hungary, right close to the river Tisa and the river Mor. So this is like what we would call like the Tisa Morish confluence, and they're right located like right at the river basin. So this area, first of all, it's like it was marshland throughout the time. So like not, it's not because it was drained in the 19th century, but at the time when these communities were living, it was a wetland. So these two sites were actually discovered very early on, so in the early 19th century, but the data that I collected was as a result of the excavation of my supervisor, Dr. John O'Shea, who excavated these sites in the 1980s.
Okay.
So yeah, so this was kind of like like Kissenbor, for example, was part of like they started doing a granary, and he got called in collaboration with the local museum. So they started doing like what we would today call like CRM work. So it's like kind of like pre-construction archaeology, where whenever somebody starts excavating on a site that is protected, there is a need of archaeological supervision. And then the other side, Clarafava, which is like directly, like it's 350 meters away from the river, was a site that was kind of like excavated, what we would say in a research manner. So that was kind of like scientifically slow excavation of a larger area.
And they're both in flood prone areas, it looks like.
Yeah.
And
So
they were all
Kizambor is further.
okay. And these are agricultural people, like they're growing grains and things like this.
Yeah, so these are like full blown like Bronze Age societies that basically cultivate, that we call it, like some people they call them like the marsh people, so because they're living within the marshlands. Our current understanding is that they had agricultural surfaces, that they domesticated animals, they breeded animals. And the interesting thing is that, which I guess is, I guess, also like a part of the result of the paper, where different communities interact in a different way depending on their immediate environment. So there is always been this preconception that all societies that belong to the same, what we would call culture group in archaeology, would react the same way to similar stressors. But now we have the understanding that it's not the case, that it's like it all depends on their immediate environment, how they react with the immediate environment. There is variation of like how these societies do that. So for example, like Kizombo, it's located a little bit further away from the immediate flood and has a little bit of a larger pastoral land in its surrounding. And as a result of that, we have evidence of all sorts of animals from all different ages. So like the majority is kind of like what we would call caprines. So it's sheep and goat,
Mm.
and pigs. And the thing is that in archaeological record, once you look at like the zooarchaeological data and looking at the age and the sex and all of that, you can determine whether they were doing some local breeding or not. So in case of Kizambor, they were doing local breeding because they have animals of all age, not only animals that are prone killing time, basically, which is like between 1 and 2, which is the case, for example, for Clarafava, where the majority of the animals are actually between those ages. So, and this was the work done by Dr. Amy Nicodemus, who actually analyzed the material for like part of her dissertation work
Hmm.
done like in 2014. And then she reanalyzed this data for a publication that is actually going to come out soon for the for the two sites. But the idea is basically that the results like didn't change, and this is what I saw as well, that it's like you can really see the differences between these two sites. Yeah.
That's interesting. I like that new way of perspective because we group things that are like we say the Maros culture, woodland culture.
Yeah.
And then like if something happens to the woodland culture in this valley, like the woodland culture in that valley is supposed to just be they're doing the same exact things. And there's not like, variations in their specialties and even how the people would adapt culturally, not even what's regionally in their valley or whatever that makes them better at one thing or the other. Okay, now, so for the people out there, let's kind of like illustrate a scene here. So we're along the Marosh and the Tiza River. And the idea with your project is you have these cultures living there at the cusp of metallurgy. So prior to metallurgy, they're still doing agriculture. They still have sheep. They still have pigs and goats around their settlements. Then metallurgy shows up in their area. It's used by their settlements, and then in theory the domesticated sheep and or the animals around these settlements and the people, then when they start working metals, they should incorporate those metals into their teeth, into their bone, because teeth is appetite and inside teeth is dentin. We talk about bone, that's collagen. They're separate kind of materials and they do different things and they're more stable and less stable, and I'm sure we'll get to that later. And so then you want to see that boundary. You want to see, can we use even different animals around a settlement to capture the environment around there, the detailed pollution environment? these teeth, these skeletons eventually make it into the ground, they're buried, they have been recovered. Now, can you tell us how you then measured lead in the teeth and the bones? And to me, it seems like the bones and teeth, wouldn't they get contaminated from being buried? I mean, did you account for that? And can you explain how you would account for potential contamination from burial?
Yeah. So first off, for this particular project, I only looked at Bronze Age. So this is like from 2000, like the sites date from 2700 to 1500. This is the period when metallurgy was already well established. Um, and so it's after the copper age. The copper age is from 4500 onwards. And during the copper age, they're already doing metallurgy. So this is like where metallurgy is already well established. They're
Well
doing it.
established.
Exactly. So this is the first thing, right? So they're already doing, so we already know that this exists in the environment. We know that they're producing it locally because we had evidence from the sites themselves. When the archaeological excavations were going through, my supervisor and his team already found some ovens, they found some debris. So we already knew that metallurgy was locally produced there. And this is significant because in a lot of cases in archaeology, we have problems finding metallurgical remains. And the
Mm,
reason being, it's because whenever metallurgy it's not conducted on a big scale, like you can lose the little data. So whenever the data is ephemeral, it's easy to lose it. So if they, for example, have an oven that they use for multiple purposes, and then they destroy it, in case if there is not like metallurgical evidence right there, you're gonna lose it. You won't know it's there. So unless you found like copper prills or objects or molds or remains of 2 yens, so like the little like clay pipes that they use to increase the temperature, unless you find that, you would think the metallurgy doesn't exist there. You would be able to find, let's say, copper, like metal objects, but evidence of actually locally produced
mm,
metallurgy
mm,
can be
mm.
easily masked, right?
Oh, yeah, that makes sense thinking about that.
Right.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
this is why I was like, okay, so we have this already there.
Mhm,
And then if we know that this is already there, where were the animals placed? Right?
mm,
Were they placed close to the settlements or they were placed further away? And if they
mm,
were placed further, because like as you know, right, we can keep animals like close to settlements, or you can, like for example, in case of sheep, like they can get pastured far away in like forest galleries or the larger surrounding area. Like for example, in areas that have topography, you see what we call transhumans. So like during the summer, they would spend some time like up hills, other times like would go downhill. And because this area is completely flat, transhumans doesn't really apply. But we have possible evidence that they were doing what we call like circular transhumans. So whenever there would be areas that would be flooded, they would move them in drier areas. Whenever it would be wet, they would move it closer to the settlements.
mhm,
So that's kind of like the background, right? And the idea is that so the animals are either closer to the settlements where they're doing metallurgy or they're further away. So this is like one possible model.
mm,
If, for example, they were doing metallurgy further away from the settlements, but not keep, but and still keeping the animals close by, you would be able to detect a similar thing, right? So the humans are inhaling like the fumes are in the surrounding, they're in the plants, the animals are inhaling it. And in other cases, like if they're doing metallurgy, let's say here, and the animals are not close by, the animals are not going to be impacted, but the humans will. So, and the surrounding soils, right? So my dissertation actually does that, both soils and teeth. But for this particular project, I was doing just teeth. So
interesting.
once this is like incorporated in the body, right? So it then moves like through different tissues. And the idea is that depending on the metal, it's going to be incorporated either in soft tissues or in hard tissues. In comparison to lead, lead is one of those elements that gets incorporated into hard tissues primarily, and it basically replaces calcium. And because it replaces, and these are kind of studies that I didn't find, but these are like the stuff that has been analyzed by dentistry and public health studies for decades at this point. And they were able to determine that is this how this relationship works and its impacts, right? And especially like as we know, like they were looking at modern studies, right? They were not looking at archaeological studies. So as you said, once the teeth get buried and the
Yeah.
material gets buried, it gets basically what we would call it comes to this interrelationship between the burial environment and the bones and the teeth, right? So what happens is at that point is if the surrounding soils where they were doing metallurgy was already contaminated and the teeth get there,
Hmm.
they get like they're basically surrounded by this like contaminated environment. And now
Hmm.
this is where the challenge is of like how do we as archaeologists or environmental scientists determine whether this is like what we would call a metabolic process, so like that it happens during life, or it's part of what we would call diagenesis or post-depositional process, where the basically the material interacts with the environment. And
Mm.
now this has been a challenge for archaeologists for a really long time, and this is why a lot of people try to analyze this like since the 1990s, but they primarily focused on bones. Now, the problem with bones is that their structure is not as strong. They are more porous.
Hmm.
Their mineral content is not as high. And so whenever this stuff interacts with the environment, there comes an exchange, right? So like as you imagine, you have this, bone buried in the soil, and then there is water coming through, there is animals like burrowing everywhere, plus
Hmm.
this like different changes happening, right? So whenever people were analyzing this, they were like, oh, look, we have these heavy metal concentrations in bones. But then they realized that this was most likely as a result of the environment. It was really hard to discern whether this was just the environment or it
Yeah.
was doing
Just
metallurgy. And exactly. And so this was
yeah.
like kind of like the stuff that for me was important because I was like, okay, so if we can't discern the difference chemically, we have to find a visual component. And this is where my research kind of like came in because I wanted to add the visual part
Mm.
to really see where are these elements stored. Because I did what we would call like ICPMS, so like wet chemistry, where you dissolve a sample and then you have like the machine. So it kind of like shows you the different range of like
Yeah.
how much metals are incorporated, as you are familiar with. And then the laser ablation, on the other hand, it's basically a similar machine, but adds a laser part of it. And
Hmm.
it enables us to create pictures. So, what we call elemental maps, in which it basically scans the entire tooth and you get a picture of the different compositions and the different amounts within the tooth.
Mm.
And what is visible is that on the outside, you can see this layer where the tooth was interacting with the environment. But at the same time, you also see where if there is any cracks in the teeth, how the different chemicals came in, or whether it has been incorporated during life, which we see once there is like once the tooth is growing, it gets into kind of like this what we call like V pattern. So if it was incorporated during life, you can kind of see as the tooth was growing, these were the elements that were incorporated during that time.
That's an interesting approach, that the laser and actually seeing the spatial variations. And just to like recap for people listening that aren't specialists, you took essentially bulk measurements of the teeth and you mapped the spatial interior concentrations of the teeth
Yeah.
using these two approaches, because you can just clean a tooth, clean it off on the outside, dissolve it, get the concentrations of metals in there. Or you could shave it in half, do a cross section, then actually use a laser to go through the layers and examine cracks. So that to me is awesome. And these new machines are just, they're kind of mind blowing. I've done a little bit of that with the electron microscope, where you
Hmm.
can kind of poke things and it'll tell you the composition of it. And you could probably do that across a tooth. That would be interesting. So
Mm-hmm.
those are your methods. And then I noticed you also sampled with a Dremel. You cleaned things with ultra pure water. And so you went through the proper protocols to try to account for the diagenic versus interior or actual lived concentration changes. Okay, so then tell us the species. So you didn't do any human teeth or any human bones, and you didn't do any bones or teeth of cultures prior to the full on metallurgy. So like 4,500 years ago, you didn't measure any samples from that. It's all just
For
for
this
the,
particular project, no,
yeah.
but for my dissertation, I did.
Cool.
So for my dissertation, the sample size is much larger and the amount of sites is larger as well. But I haven't actually, I've done some studies on humans, but not a lot. And the reason
Okay.
being, it's because from 4,500 onwards, humans are buried in communal cemeteries, and it's really hard to discern where are these individuals coming from, whether they're coming from this settlement or this settlement or this settlement, right?
I see.
And for this reason, I was then like, okay, if I want to know from settlement to settlement base, I need to
Mm,
go into the settlement itself. Because
yeah.
if I look at the humans, like I won't be able to discern that, because from mortuary archaeology, we know that whatever we found in the cemeteries goes through a very strict mortuary practice. So it could mean that certain people who are metallurgists might not even be buried there. Or if they're buried there, they could not have been buried with things that could actually imply that he's a metallurgist or not. So this is actually like a big future project of
Okay.
like trying to do something like this. But at this particular moment, like there is, I haven't done any work. I know that there were some attempts to do on human bones, but for our particular area and time period, it's actually really hard to do that because there is only so many cemeteries, and this material is extremely precious. And it's also the fact that, if there's one cemetery and there are all these settlements around it, it's hard to know whether this person was buried or not. So it would require like a completely different dissertation to be able to do that.
Yeah.
But
You can only
as a
focus on
result,
some.
exactly. And then as a result of that, I used pigs as a proxy for humans, because pigs like have an omnivorous diet. Their teeth grow in a similar pattern as humans. So like the kind of like what we call like kind of like onion. So it kind of like grows like this in comparison to other teeth.
Okay.
So they are the closest kind of like to basically like human in terms of also like digestion and all of this kind of stuff. So they're like I use them as a big basically as a proxy to
To
humans, and they
human.
would be, yeah.
That
And
makes
then
sense.
I also analyzed sheep and goat and deer, basically.
Okay, yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to ask is, so I didn't want to get too far. I want to get into the historical measurements, especially with Clair Patterson and providing context for pre-metallurgy skeletal dental concentrations, because it's very interesting the comparison between metallurgical society, bones and teeth, and pre. But yeah, I didn't want to get too far into that right now because I just wanted to first focus on this study here is you did pigs, sheep, goats around these two Bronze Age settlements and deer, right? And so the deer are wild, the goats are
The intermediate. They're
intermediate.
domesticated. They're domesticated, but we kind of where we keep them is kind of the
They're like sort of
intermediate
wild,
according to the
yeah.
model.
And then you have pigs and sheep, and they're going to be domesticated.
Yeah. So pig, sheep, and goat are all domesticated, but where they're kept in relation to the settlement could differ.
Good to, okay. Now, if you remember off the top of your head, I didn't write it down. What's your sample size like for the two sites? Even number of teeth, or if you can remember details.
Ooh, I don't know the project, like, because it's like so this project has been done in 2022, and since they actually increased the sample size. Because the idea was for this pilot site to only use teeth that were fully complete without any visual cracks. So it was a smaller sample size, I think in the 30. But this got increased immediately after I realized that this is a possible methodology that I could be using for the dissertation. And I also realized that there is where to sample, what to sample, how to sample, and all of that kind of stuff. So this was kind of like a trial and error. These are the results of the trial and error, basically, of like 3 years.
Oh, okay. Okay. Uh, let's just let's assume you have a pretty decent sample size at this point. It sounds like it's not like one or two teeth from
No.
each site. Yeah, you have a good amount. So let's tell us about the patterns you see in metals between the different species. Do you see any patterning? And when you talk about these patterns, I know you measured lead, but you also measured lead ratio to calcium, and you looked at both of those. So maybe talk about what's the species, the patterns in the species, and then what you saw using those two different proxies.
So in general, I use like a much larger number of elements, but I focused for this paper particularly, I focused on the relationship between calcium and lead.
Lead.
So
Okay, that's good to know.
one thing that I've done was basically the reason why I want to do a larger sample size is because I assume that there is going to be some like individual variation of like either age or other things that could like impact. So like different variables that basically could impact the reason why I see this kind of levels. Because one thing we know about lead is that it impacts like much more younger individuals. And this has been seen like
Yeah,
in human studies as well, right?
yeah.
So like when the animal is growing, so the amount of lead is like much higher and it can impact the animal much faster than it would if the animal is older when it gets exposed. And so this is why I was kind of aiming for a larger sample size. But what I've seen, it's a distinct difference between pigs, sheep and goat, and deer. Now, the reason why I say sheep and goat is because in the archaeological record it's really hard to discern whether some like an animal is either sheep or a goat because they have really similar dentition and like
Mhm.
similar skeletons. Unless you find the whole skeleton, in a lot of cases, it's really hard to discern from one single tooth. Right. So
Mm.
in a lot of cases, I didn't have complete mandibles, but I had like one or two teeth, which I could tell whether it was like a second or third molar. So like the back teeth, which are the last ones to form basically in an animal and in humans as well.
Okay.
But the idea was basically once I've done all the analysis, I saw that pigs were kind of like grouping on one side, sheep and goat on one side, and deer on one side. And what was really interesting was that it appears that even within the pigs, that appears to be two different groups. Some of them with higher concentration, some of them with lower concentration. And that to me was really interesting because I went into this project with the idea of like, okay, pigs are going to have the highest amount because they're omnivorous. They can eat they can eat a human refuse. They can be kept like the closest to the settlement, so the most exposed to metallurgy. And then sheep will have the kind of intermediate, and the deer wouldn't have anything, right? And the deer and the sheep kind of show that there is kind of like the sheep were kind of the intermediate, the sheep and goat or the caprids rather show this kind of like intermediate amount where there's some of them showed a little bit higher, but not like super low, but also
Mhm,
not super high.
mhm,
And the deer kind of showed nothing.
mhm,
And that was interesting because like the pigs on the other hand were kind of like a little bit yes, a little bit no. And I'm like, okay, this is weird because the assumption was like they should have the highest, but they didn't.
mm.
So my assumption was like that it looks like that the pigs that we are actually can talk not just by sheep kind of like husbandry practices, but also how they were feeding the pigs. because it looks like that the pigs and the sheep were both like at some point also pastured away from the settlement, so like in the surrounding galleries, and maybe there were pigs especially are known in the area. We know this from ethnographic studies that were pastured in local galleries and fed nuts, basically like acorns,
Mm.
for example. And if they would have been kept and pastured there for a while, like you would be able to see that in the tooth. And that's exactly what I was able to see once I did the elemental mapping. Basically, I could really see like periods of high intensity and periods of low intensity. And that was really interesting
Well, that
because
is
it
interesting.
right, because, like, I thought that is I went with the conceptions, like, they're all gonna have high, the signal is gonna be pretty uniform, because I was assuming the diet, or maybe it's gonna have, like, some high intensity episode depending when they're doing metallurgy. But it showed that it's like, okay, there was a period that was high, there was a period that was the highest, and there was a period that was nothing within the same tooth. And I was like, "Oh my goodness, that's that's actually pretty cool."
Yeah.
And it was the same thing for sheep, actually. The same in the sample that I analyzed, you could see the similar pattern where you could be like, okay, there were periods where it was high and there were periods where there was nothing. And it's like, so it looks like that the sheep and the pigs were kind of like at some points of time, they were pastured closer to the settlements, fed like other, like, in the winter or whatever, like they were pastured there, they were more exposed to metallurgy. So the metallurgy was happening at that time.
Mm.
And then maybe during another time of the year, they were pastured somewhere else. And so they were not close to metallurgy, or they were actually metallurgy was not conducted during that time. So that was actually to me was really interesting. Plus the differences between the two sites, which was also kind of stark.
Really, what do you mean? Like the differences
So
between two sites?
the
Average?
interesting, no, just in general, it's like the pattern, because what was really interesting is that Clarifava, considering that it's so close to the river,
Hmm.
and it's surrounded by marshes and water. And so what it looks like that during certain particular period of the year, the animals were kept closer to the settlement and thus exposed more to heavy metals than other parts of time. And then on the other hand, the ones from Kizumbor, they were kind of like a little bit all over the place. So it means that they were doing metallurgy in different areas, because that area is actually like that site is further removed from the water, and it has more pastured areas, is drier, and it has a larger surface. So it looks like that they were like the animals were kind of everywhere and they were doing metallurgy in different areas of the site, while Kizambor, Clarifava was kind of like more compressed because they didn't have enough space. So, and that was also like really interesting to kind of like see
Wow.
that interaction where they kept the animals in relation to the environment.
Hmm. So another way you can look at this is the signal in the almost the metallurgy signal is recorded in variance in the
Hmm.
concentrations rather than absolute
Yeah,
averages. So
yeah,
when you
and
see
that.
more variation, that's telling you something. And then and that, there's something going, inputs are variable to that animal. So that's interesting to think about it that way. And then the deer would have, in theory, the lowest variation because they're the furthest from the settlements
Mhm.
and eating the most consistent wild diet.
But what we can see though is that in certain periods, the deer appear to have come closer to the settlement. So they were a little bit exposed to either to the actual metallurgy or to plants that, once you have like once you're doing metallurgy, it goes in the soils that like the plants absorb it, and it primarily goes in the upper part, so like the seeds and that area. So
Right.
it's possible that the wild animals were coming closer and actually eating some of these cultivated plants, and then getting a little bit of a higher, not too high, but like a little bit higher than expected. Yeah, which was cool.
That's a good thing to bring up is like how they actually ingested these metals, these
Mm,
animals, because pollution, just because I've written and published stuff about pollution, when you say the word pollution, it's a politically charged word because it really wasn't in use until Earth Day in the 60s. And it has all this baggage when you say the word pollution. But pollution can also just be measurable inputs of metals derived from human activity. above natural levels that necessarily aren't having a negative health effect or even really a measurable ecological environmental effect that we can determine. All lead in the environment and in our bodies is toxic, but exactly when you get to that level of it making a huge difference is debated. It's pretty low, I would say. The issue with the reason I want to bring up pollution is because when we're thinking about metallurgy contaminating the environment, why are we focused on metallurgy and why is it contaminating the environment? Well, in the environment, heavy metals like lead and mercury and cadmium and a few other elements, they're not really cycled naturally by biological things, trees, photosynthesis, you know, anything, any of the natural process, chemical weathering of regular silicate rocks, erosion. And so when you see elevated heavy metals, it's because some process preferentially release these heavy metals into the environment. And it turns out metalworking is actually the best way to do that we know about. Outside of extreme volcanic environments, like volcanic vents, we're not talking about that. We're talking only like the regular surface of the earth, the regular surface of the ocean. So these heavy metals are preferentially released into the environment above other elements like calcium, sodium, potassium that are naturally weathered, naturally cycled in the environment. So we can actually look at how lead increases relative to natural metals and to get at that question and just measuring the pollution. The
Hmm.
other thing to remember when we're talking about pollution is the conservation of mass. So how does metallurgy impact? How does it preferentially release metals? Well, you take ore, you put it in a fire, which is essentially a chemical reaction with the heat and oxygen. Then that releases particulates, especially lead because it has a low melting temperature. And those are then transferred or transported in the air in terms of chimneys, it's a low pressure point, which means air is rising because it's hot. That launches these elements into the sky. So when you burn something, it doesn't just disappear into the ether. It actually, there's conservation of mass. We can't destroy or create mass. So when you do an ore and it goes through the chimney and it goes up in the air, it's like a plume, a mushroom cloud. And all those elements, you can't see them. They're settling on the grass surfaces. They're getting incorporated into the soils, into the peatlands, into the lakes, and then the animals right onto the animals' surfaces. But the animals are eating that, drinking that water along with the humans. And so you're incorporating that into your body. And even today, why are we so worried about kids getting lead pollution? Well, they eat a lot of dirt. They crawl outside, their hands are dirty, they put it in their mouth. And that's how you get lead into your body. This is exactly what's happening with these animals as you're finding. So it's very interesting though that the variation through time is even notable in the growth layers of the teeth. Would you call them growth layers? You called it the onion effect, which I thought was interesting. But those layers, they can be timed to certain parts of the animal's development, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So the idea is that different teeth will show you a different developmental stage of the animal, in where we say that it's like different species develop what we call the M3, so your wisdom tooth, technically, at different times. And so these teeth, primarily because animals are technically slaughtered right before these teeth are fully developed. So I focused on the second molar, which is the one that has a little bit of the mother signal, but the bottom part, so which is the last one to develop, it's the one that shows the adult portion of the animal. And so this is why kind of like it shows the reason why I said onion effect, because I really like
Yeah, that's good.
because it kind of like develops in layers, right?
Mhm.
And there are studies both like, they're doing like fully like studies of teeth development and histological studies. Primarily they kind of show the development, how they grow. You can count days, how long were they exposed and things like that, which I didn't particularly do for this study, but I know of studies that were kind of like show these differences, basically how many days was like an exposure to a certain mineral or something like that. And to your point earlier, one thing that I wanted to say is like, I think the distinction between pollution and contamination, I think it's crucial exactly for what you were mentioning earlier, because the term pollution, it's so socially charged,
Yeah, right.
um, which is not something that we can potentially imply in the past. Right,
Mm,
because it's like today, it's like we know that pollution, it's actually as a result, it's like it's also it describes a reaction
mm,
as well, right? It's like it tries a magnitude and a social reaction, usually related to like social justice, for example, right? Like especially areas that are more exposed to heavy metals are usually like, lower developed areas and things like that.
mm,
So I like this is why throughout my study I was trying to avoid the
mhm,
word pollution as much.
mhm.
Well, it's catchy, right? But it doesn't necessarily fully describe what is happening.
Right.
And this is why I was kind of like more focused on the word contamination until I would have like the enough data to actually say, yes, this is pollution. Because to a certain extent, I don't think at this point that people were actually, at this point in time,
Mhm.
I don't think they were aware that this was like causing them issues.
Oh, that's a good way to put it. If you're not aware of what you're doing, is it pollution? Because yeah, you're implying you're pushing it above a level, and that we should then remediate that issue when we say pollution. There's plastic pollution. That means there's too much of it, and we should bring it down because it's bad. And if you don't know, you're not aware of it, it's not pollution in a way, but it's still measurably scientifically contaminated or something. Yeah, so
Exactly.
that's I bring up that pollution thing because when I did the copper papers and it's like
Mm-hmm.
and it's implying indigenous pollution, I had comments saying like liberals want to bring up pollution in like the ancient times and make it an issue. And I was like, I that's a good point because I was like, yeah, they didn't pollute it to the point where it was like in any way comparable to today or
Yeah.
even necessarily bad for them, maybe a few
Right.
part per million, but it was still measurable. It's still contamination.
Exactly. And exactly like you're saying, right? Like I think this is like a really important point. It's also like, the copper mines in Michigan and like the area where you did your work, it's like one of the purest,
It's one of the pure.
right,
Yeah.
in the world. Like in comparison to like the area that I'm studying, like copper, it's like the ores that we're getting, they're not pure. Like they're
Yeah.
very mixed. This is why they start alloying and adding things,
Yeah.
because it's like they're not as pure. Like for example, the time, like when we're looking like the metallurgical development, right? You kind of like have copper
Mhm.
metallurgy, then you start having arsenic bronze in
Mhm.
certain areas, then you start having tin bronze in other areas, right? And the arsenic and the tin are just additions to the copper that change the chemical composition. But arsenic, as we know, is highly toxic,
Highly toxic.
right?
Yes.
And it's could have caused even visual differences in people, right? We
Mm.
know what happens when people are exposed to arsenic a lot. Like you get like what we call roses, like you get like spots on your skin. Like it's really like, and it's like within 20 minutes, like you can die.
Yeah.
Right? Like if you're constantly exposed to it. So like these are not chemicals that they would be able, like, I think there was a lot of trial and error. That's
Mhm.
what I'm trying to say, right? It's
Mhm.
like whenever you have like a high amount of exposure, like this is bad,
Yeah.
right? But I
Yeah.
don't like while they saw it, like it's a question of how they understood this. Right. And we will
Mm.
never know to a
Yeah.
certain extent, right? Which is a bummer. But at the same time, it's also one of those things that it's like it's it's important to keep in mind, right, that
Right.
there are certain things that sadly with archaeology we will not be able to discover, but it is important to kind of like keep in mind that there is like they could have perceived this in a completely different way than we do today, right?
Right. Yeah, that is, you imagine back in that time, they all of a sudden get access to like a new ore, and then like at the trade site, they're like, "This ore is great. Just throw it in the urn."
Yeah.
And someone brings up, they're bringing it up, and like they're gonna give it a shot, and it's like this is like a mercury arsenic rich version of a tin ore,
Right.
and they had no idea. And a few
Right.
breaths in, and like the kid falls over, and everyone dies, and they're like, "Okay, no one use that stuff anymore. We're going back to the
Yeah.
old stuff."
You know what's also really interesting? It's like because a lot of these ores are very highly colored, right? And there
Mm,
were like several studies of being like, how did they know that this was good for smelting, right? And like for example, like in the area where I work, they primarily work with malachite, which is like this like really bright green. So imagine like, walking through the landscape and you have this cliff and all of a sudden you see a bright or like green like line, right? And it's
yeah,
like it's very easy to discern. And I mean, there were others, right? You had like also blue and green and different colors, but it's like color probably also played a little bit of
for
like
sure.
a role in this as well.
For sure. When you're looking at identifying minerals, oh yeah, like metal ores, they're very rare overall on the surface of the earth, and they're usually found along volcanic terrains. And there's just interesting metals and lusters. There's metallic lusters. You'll see a lot of reduced iron, pyrite, and they're just going to be very weird looking, and they're going to attract people, yeah,
Attention.
their attention. Even in the copper districts, you'll find a lot of the copper bearing minerals, not the metal, right next to where the metals are found. And those are just green, white, pink. They're
Mm-hmm.
beautiful. And like, I would imagine someone would see those and be like, okay, that must be the area we're looking, because those are the colors I'm looking for. But yeah, you wouldn't otherwise know, like, when you found a new ore body or you get a new trade partner and they have something they're offering you and they're like, you wouldn't even know what's going to happen. Like when we mix this to this and we add a bunch of heat, like it could just blow off. In South America, they used, they had the mercury
Mm-hmm.
to amalgamate gold, and then
Mm-hmm.
you burn off the mercury. Now, mercury, even at such tiny levels, is so toxic, especially to pregnant people. That actually causes
Yeah.
birth defects, and I think arsenic does too. So that's another
Yes.
side. You can maybe in these cultures, if somehow you could have a full picture, you might see more birth defects in
Yes.
working rich cultures than,
And also miscarriages.
and maybe, yeah, maybe probably that too. But you'd think that that mercury, they must have known after a while, because even today, the people that do the mercury amalgamation, like it's so unbelievably toxic. It's like everything you get the gold to dissolve in the mercury into a little thing. You then literally burn off the mercury next to it, and it goes into your lungs, and that's the worst. I mean, mercury's got to be up there with like lead as the top two, maybe
Yeah.
most toxic metals. So
Yeah, if not even more, considering that it's like it causes like some bone growth and all of that. I mean, mercury and cadmium both are also very toxic, right?
yeah, I
I
mean, I
mean,
guess
like they both, yeah, they both like cause like any kind of like skeletal defects as well. So yeah, not just mental, right? Because a lot of these metals cause like
mental,
organ problems, but also they affect the brain. And
right?
there were several studies what I was reading while I'm writing my dissertation. It's that age, it's very important in this. I mean, it's like sex also for human, but also age, because once you get older and starting getting osteoporosis, for example, so if you were exposed to metals in young age and then nothing, and then in the old age, these bones start, breaking down, it gets reintroduced in your system,
Yes,
which is like it's awful, right?
right.
And this is like this is like the part is like it's to me it's so interesting about this because it's like it's not a one-time fix. Once you're exposed to it, it's there.
Yeah,
It doesn't like it's like it just gets recycled in your body, and it's very dangerous. And I think we have the awareness that this is dangerous and this is causing issues, but I don't think we fully grasp even to nowadays how actually problematic it is
mhm,
for the long term, right?
mhm.
For multiple generations. There are numerous studies that were done, for example, on arsenic that show changes from multiple generations in terms of size, in terms of overall health. Like this is like a multi-generational issue. It's not just within one particular individual.
Yeah, and it probably affects your epigenetics too.
Yes.
Along with all that, the impacts the eggs of the mother and the grandmother, and that passes down through. So it's a huge, and that's why this work is so important to place context to the modern changes, to understand What are natural base levels? How did this modern contamination level we're seeing today come to be? And then what, in theory, can we do to reduce that and get us back to these levels that we found in pre-metallurgical societies? So that's just emphasizes how important this work is, and doing and helping us understand those things. So I want to kind of take a turn here in the conversation, but I do want to get one more technical thing in. I want to emphasize that you looked at both. You tried to account for diagenesis by ratioing lead to calcium, and you also looked at magnesium and iron, which are
Mhm.
redox sensitive elements. And you found that in certain groups, especially pigs, lead is enriched especially above calcium. So that really is a strong signal of pollution, because in some of the pigs, though, notice high lead and high calcium. So the high calcium suggests that there's some added component from the soil. So you were
Mhm.
very, very careful in looking at that. But could you maybe tell me why you looked at magnesium and iron a little bit more, and then why would that impact lead, do you think?
So, in a lot of cases, whenever people were studying diagenesis, so this interaction between the environment and the object, one of the two most, I guess, elements that interact at the same time as lead, because they're both in the environment, were magnesium and iron. And considering that the soils where I'm working are kind of high in iron, it was kind of like used as an indicator of like diagenesis.
Hmm.
The problem is that both elements are also present in the teeth. So it was kind of like just looking at, wet chemistry would have been really hard to discern the signal. There were studies done on trying to locate the maximum concentration and lowest concentration. So the maximum concentration would kind of be above the average, not just in terms of contamination, but the biggest amount that you would actually get as a result of diagenesis. So, like, depending on the level of these elements, you would be able to discern whether something came in contact with the soils or not. And now, when I was doing this kind of study, I wanted to see how these elements also store, because considering that these elements are also present in the body, I wanted to see whether they have the same accumulation pattern as lead. And when I was doing the imaging with the laser ablation, I actually noticed that they don't store in the same way. So I was able to see that lead, for example, gets incorporated according to the growth pattern, while the other two didn't. The other two just showed that they came from the outside, what in the paper I called as like radiation events, where you can kind of, instead of like seeing it nicely grow within the tooth, you kind of like see them like kind of on the top radiating. So what happens is when you chew it, and this surface gets exposed, so the dentin gets exposed, and then this area is like the prime location where outside elements can come in. So I was able to see, like, on the top of the tooth especially, how like these elements were leaching in the tooth, in the dentin primarily, right? And the same thing happened like wherever there was a crack in the tooth, you could see the same pattern. So if there was a crack, you could see high magnesium, high iron, and high lead.
Mm.
On the very top, the same thing, high magnesium, high iron, high lead. But inside the tooth, how the growth pattern went, magnesium and iron were not there. They were present in terms of the amount, but they were not showing the same kind of incorporation as lead did. So that was an indicator to me that they are stored and they're presented in different ways, the tooth.
And there, you call it diagenic indicator. Then it's almost like telling us. And I might have said the wrong thing, but I want to be clear. We're talking about manganese. I may have said magnesium too. I don't, but we are looking at manganese and iron for the geochemists that are watching this, not
Yeah.
magnesium, because that,
Magnesium is also present in the tooth, but not in that
yeah.
way.
And we know manganese and iron are very redox sensitive elements in soil, sediment. It's just a well established thing we know about. Okay, now the turn of events here. So this is something I'm very interested in, and I think a lot of people are are going to be interested in when they watch this is this understanding of the long-term changes of metals in human tissue and really just how anomalous recent pollution is in the context of even archaeological remains. And this has really started with the work of Clair Patterson, who is the guy that calculated the age of the Earth. He used uranium and lead to calculate the age of the Earth and determined that his samples were contaminated by lead. So he figured out how to clean the lab to determine the age of the Earth. But this led him on a whole side quest of his life to determine how his lab got contaminated with lead. So then this led to a public health phenomenon: removal of leaded gasoline, removal of lead soldering from soup cans, water pipes, different makeups, paint, just absolutely incredible. And no one knows about Clair Patterson. But when he first approached people and were like, hey, my lab is contaminated with lead, he probably said it a better way. The people in the industry, there's a professor from University of Cincinnati and other prominent people in the 60s were like, no, the lead in the environment is natural. The deaths around us, we haven't reached anything anomalous in Earth's history. That lead is normal. And it turns out these scientists were also being paid by the lead industry. So I wonder why. And they were also public health experts. So this is why we have to be careful when we just rely on experts without, understanding if there's a bit of a conflict of interest. But Claire was like, you're crazy. I can prove it. And so he went to the end of the earth to prove that the 20th century was contaminated. First, he analyzed ice cores. He went to take ocean cores to analyze the layers. But the thing that was really interesting is he analyzed he analyzed mummies from Peru and Egypt. And he measured the teeth and bone concentrations in both of those. And so Egypt was a metallurgy society, and the Peruvian mummies were supposedly pre-metallurgy. Then he had plenty of samples from modern day British and American people from the 20th century. And what he found was unbelievable. The modern 20th century people were like thousands of times higher in their lead to calcium ratios in their teeth than Peruvian mummies. So we were through the roof high, and I think even Egypt was like higher than the Peruvian mummies in order of magnitude. And those were like something 4,000-year-old people, something around the age of the people you're working with. So this whole like context of developing this long time series of skeletal is super interesting to me, because then I guess we could then kind of frame where should we be at, aim our public health towards that in order to find out. And that's why I kind of asked you about your previous work. And maybe, I know it's not published, but do you see a huge magnitude increase between your like your 4,000-year-old sites versus your Bronze Age solid sites? And you want to talk about that?
Well, I can give just like a sneak peek, basically.
Okay. And
but yeah,
you're working on this, right? For like a paper or?
Yeah.
Okay.
This is my dissertation that will be hopefully done soon. But one thing that I noticed, because like as you said, right, like these are kind of like large, like what he analyzed, but it's kind of like big regional, multi-regional systems, right? Because like the particles come from all over. And, environmental scientists, you yourself included, kind of show that there is a variation in time, how this accumulates, right? And we have like evidence of like when does this start. So it starts with metallurgy technically, right? Like around 4,500, 5,000 BC. And then through time, we see like this curve going up and down. And it goes much, much, much higher during the Roman time.
Yes. Yep.
When with the Roman expansion, right? When the expansion like of the empire, when Roman becomes an empire, and that was kind of linked with the higher production of weapons during that time. And then it drops during the early medieval time, and then it skyrockets. Like post like 18th century, so industrial revolution, and today it's like it's so high it goes off the charts. But what is really interesting is that like this like big regional work like kind of gives us a background, an idea of what should be looking at. So this is why I was interested to kind of like, let's go to the very beginning and assess how much of this very early it's contamination, right?
Hmm.
And what I saw it's that it's so, like I said earlier, it's so dependent from the settlement to settlement. It's not universe,
Mm.
and like I'm analyzing a very small area technically. There is a maximum of like 50 kilometers between these sites, right? And so this is like a very small region that kind of shows a similar environment. So it's all kind of like wetland. They're all part of the similar cultural groups. So it's kind of like all of the archaeological evidence kind of like shows that these are similar, what we call archaeologically similar groups. And what is shown that is like in the early times, so like the 4500, where we technically have metallurgy, there is not a lot of local production. So the levels are very, very low to almost non-existent. And then once it comes to Bronze Age, when there is local production, you see it going up. But still, it's so different from site to site.
Hmm.
Because we have one site, for example, that archaeologically, and I helped excavating it as well, like at this point 10 years ago. But when we were excavating, there was so much metals. There was so much like there were ovens that were overimposed with the amount of like copper prills, molds, like objects, like you name it. There was so much of it. And then the animal data showed nothing. And this was like was really interesting because like I was looking at the archaeological data, and the archaeological showed a lot. The soils showed a lot.
Hmm.
Animal data, nothing.
Nothing.
And so if you just look at the animal data, you would be like, oh, there is no contamination. But what it seems to be happening is that these animals are coming from somewhere else. So they are bringing them to the settlement. So this
Mm.
settlement looks like it was specialized in this particular activity, and it was probably like getting animals from somewhere else. Because if they would be pastured, even in the like close vicinity, they would have some
Mm.
contamination, but it didn't. And this is why I say that it's so like the environment, like and the location of the environment, the interaction of human environment, it's crucial when you're looking at like this kind of stuff, because there is so much variation of like even communities that basically they do the same, they're all contemporaneous,
Mm.
but they're doing things radically different, and the contamination is different. I mean, and we're still not like talking to modern contamination. We're not talking about, like the kind of like pollution effects that we see. But they still show that there is some present. So this is like what I think it's also like interesting. It's like, yes, we have like larger regional evidence, which environmental work showed, but on the like person, like to the level, this is where people could be like, oh, but there is no contamination going on. There is no pollution going on at this particular site because we have one line of evidence, which again, it's not true once you look at the whole picture. And it's like you have to look at multiple lines of evidence, multiple variables, and making sure that how you're placing your model, it's very strict. So I was very lucky in this way because all settlements were excavated by the same people. So the same sampling procedure, the samples were available, and it showed like a very deep, what we would call chronological stratification. So a lot of these sites were what we would call tells. So it means that people were kind of inhabiting like one layer, and because everything is flat, it creates this artificial but like basically mound, where it's basically settlement upon settlement, so house upon house upon house upon house, right? And I was really lucky because I was able to have all of this sampling through time. So it wasn't just like I have a Bronze Age layer and that's it, but I had like from 4500 all the way up to the Iron Age. But I didn't focus on the Iron Age because the Iron Age is a whole different
Yeah.
monster to deal with in terms of metallurgy. So yeah.
Now at the sites, tell us about what kind of metallurgy was actually happening there. You're talking about alloying, and
Thing.
yeah, what were they doing? Tell us in a nutshell. They were
Tin,
making tin
tin bronze.
and bronze. And this involved smelters. You're saying ceramic smelters that they blew in, and they mixed
Hmm.
together copper ore and tin ore in these things. Okay. And these tin and copper ores are, you're saying, found somewhat regionally.
So some of them, and that's the part that like we don't quite know for copper where it comes from. We know that, we have copper ores in the eastern part of Serbia, but we also know that there are the metal mountains, so from the Carpathian Mountains, and that this area is kind of like framed in between it. But we also have evidence archaeologically, not particularly for this region yet, hopefully at some point, but at this point, like we know that at the time of the Middle Bronze Age, tin gets also imported from Britain. So like there are numerous sources like throughout the area. So there are like these big networks going on during this time period.
That's far. I mean, that's crazy. And
Yeah.
I guess
So like, and this is what the work of like archaeometallurgists is so important because like it shows like possible networks and interaction of how these people interacted. Because as we know, once people interact, it's not just like an exchange of materials, it's exchange of ideas, it's exchange of life ways, right? So it's like it shows how this period was basically shaped through this interaction. So it's like it's really amazing because we always think like it's this like little contained container, but it's really not. It's like it's a large interaction like across Europe at this point of time. Yeah.
even, yeah, yeah, by the Bronze Age, then there's like almost a continental scale economy moving stuff around. Wow. Um, Now you mentioned earlier these like time series of metals through time. And you said it goes up during the Roman times, it goes down during the Dark Ages, goes back up in the 18th, 19th century. You're talking about, I know there's some lake sediment cores, but that is Joe O'Connell's new paper, which was a particularly high resolution record from the Greenland ice core that has
Hmm.
shown this. The first evidence for the Roman increase comes from, I believe, Hong in the 90s. He did like a low resolution analysis of the Greenland ice core. So Greenland is very far away from Western Europe. If you're aware of Earth, you'll know. So we're talking about Greenland ice cores for measuring Western Europe pollution. Now, Joe analyzed layer by layer, and I think probably used a laser ICPMS. I'm not sure though, but he did very high resolution, and he looked at year to year changes in lead delivered to Greenland, and he could track droughts, plagues, wars, collapses of economy, the decline of the Roman Empire. And it's just absolutely remarkable that the lead is almost like a history book of Western Europe. And it even records the Dark Ages where, the economy collapses, another way to look at it, of Western Europe, and there's no reason to mine. There's no denarius in circulation anymore. That was a big source of mining to make the coin for the Roman Empire, especially in the Spanish area. We use lake records to look at lead from that. In your basin, though, near your site, we don't clearly don't have any ice records, but has anyone looked at lake sediments or peat records? Because that's another way we can analyze lead changes through time. They deposit in lakes in the sediment layers at the bottom. Any records near your sites, and do they tell you anything about your time period?
So what is really interesting, it's like immediately next to me, this kind of work? No, but there are in the larger region. So, like in Eastern Serbia, Longman et al. Have done some work, and Varish as well. Like, so they've done like in the larger region, but they have like there is no work. There are some like pollen records, for example, done about 15 kilometers from the sites, which are showing some climatic basically reconstructions of like how did the environment look like during the time period, which are done through river meanders.
Mm,
But there is no, like the problem in the area is that this area was drained in the 19th century. So
yeah.
because it was a wetland, Like during the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they basically drained, like they were trying to reduce the flooding, and it went down for 3 or 4 meters. So it's a substantial change. And like there was a lot of channeling done and all this kind of stuff that radically changed how the landscape looked like.
Mm,
And the reason why they were doing this is because they wanted to increase agricultural services for
mm,
production and to be able to increase subsistence for the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then since then, there were also like other types of regulations that we see in the rivers as well. But in terms of like pollution levels that we will be able to monitor, there hasn't been done a lot of work. This is why like I primarily like started analyzing the actual soil samples
mm,
from the sites themselves,
hmm.
because I was like, I don't have any other close by record that could help me build this up. And whether there would be some work that I don't know, like you're the you're the
Yeah.
environmental scientist, you would be able to say like if there are some areas that would be more suitable for this kind of work. I imagine areas that don't have a lot of moving water, right? Because like those would technically compromise this kind of research.
That could be part, yeah, and I would just wanted you to bring up, Ryan Longman's work, because I know he cored that in Serbia. I know him
Yeah.
personally, and I think you
Yeah.
talked to him as well.
Yeah, I did.
But
Yeah.
that
His
record
work is
from
fantastic. Yeah.
he's he's a prolific
Yeah.
author. I mean, he's might be I think he's younger than me, and I mean, he's published way more than me, but his work in Serbia is technically the oldest evidence in Europe for lead pollution in sediments, at least like
Yeah.
um above natural levels.
Yeah. And his work actually, it's one of them that I use as a baseline, for my work. But the problem is that where my sites are located are much more north than the area that he was doing the peat work. So but it does show, like you said, right? It shows exactly that. It shows like high contamination during the Bronze
Right.
Age, which is kind of like really nice resolution. It adds on the resolution in the area. And that was like one thing that he in his papers like stressed a lot, that is like we need regional models, not just like, this larger, like whatever happens in Greenland
Greenland.
can give us an idea of what is happening largely, but we do need like also like regional samples to be able to actually, monitor better what happens on the regional level.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you're looking for a record near your site, one thing you would look for would be a small lake watershed catchment that is topographically elevated on the hill. So it's only receiving water from rain and precipitation and minimal groundwater movement. I like it when there's no stream coming in or stream leaving the lake, because that way, everything goes in through the precip, and then it leaves from evaporation or a little bit of out seepage from groundwater, but it leaves the elements in there. Lead doesn't evaporate out of lakes, water does. So it's just good at those. And I think I've looked around your site, but it's hard to find all those in one area. But Longman found one up there. And that peat record, I believe, shows evidence of increasing it 5,000 years ago. Um,
Yeah, it shows like right at the time when my research starts. So he shows that around 4,500 we have the evidence, and this is like right collides with like the start of metallurgy. And then with his work, he shows the time resolution of like kind of like how it goes, and it matches perfectly the archaeological record, because it goes like, we have like high metallurgy, and then we have a little bit of a hiatus, and then it goes up again, it goes a little bit down, and then goes up again. And it kind of like shows nicely like on the kind of general archaeological, very general, I'm talking very general patterns in the archaeological record.
wow.
So it's a very significant work for sure.
It's like, yes, go Lakes, because they seem to keep working and they're really a good archive
Yeah.
of that. It's like
Definitely.
it's when you see it match up so perfectly, you're just like, wow.
Yeah. And this is the good part, right? It's like
yeah.
it's combining the different sciences. I think that was like brings strength to the argument, right? You see it like in the ecological record, you're seeing how communities are doing, and then you're matching it with the environmental. Because like one without the other, yes, we provide some experience, but like combining the two and really talking between different scientists, right? Like I think that really brings like a whole different picture to these kind of questions.
Hmm. Yeah. And I call them almost the lake sediments and versus the artifacts, the skeletal remains. Those are, I call them two windows to look at the past. So in the windows, you look through the lake sediment, you look through your archaeological, osteological remains, and you're seeing the same thing through the windows. That means it's good. There's something, it's truth. You're learning something new here. And Jack's work with that, the first look in that deep time into Eastern Europe, he shows that increase 5,000 years ago. That's significant because the econal work we talked about in Greenland, it doesn't record pollution back that far. I think it has a little bit of a Greek signal in there, ancient Greek, but it's really dominated by the Roman signal. And so finding evidence of pre-Roman increases in Europe is very rare. And that's really the boundary of what we're looking at. It's so well established that the Roman Empire in its metallurgy really changed Western Europe's metal cycle. But
Right.
that earlier time period is really unknown. And that's going to be where that regional signals be going to become very, very important, because it's not enough to affect Greenland, but it's probably enough to affect those local sites like Longman has said.
Also, what you mentioned, like in the very beginning, it's like those papers were done in the 90s. Like now, with the resolution of technology and like how quickly the machines become like, we go from parts per million to parts per billion. Like the resolution is so much higher. These machines are getting out of control, how accurate and how good they are. So I think that's also plays a little bit a part in it.
Hmm.
The type of data that we're getting, it's much more focused. The machines are much more like they're stronger. So, and the amount of data that we're getting, like when different people doing work, it's increasing the amount of data sets and data points that we're getting. So combining this all three, we can get like a much higher resolution and really discerning even like small changes. And I think that's like also very significant, right? Like not just like from larger but
Yeah.
region, but also like the scales,
Right.
right, that we're talking about, and really discerning what these scales even are, right?
Right.
Because whenever you were saying earlier with like, if the Roman part is like it's so high and dominating, like those like little things are gonna get lost in the background.
Mm.
But now we are able to really like discern of like how much it's a little,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah. How much we can almost measure lead increases in lakes above natural levels in peat bogs and other things at a level that's you can't imagine. We're talking part per million level. And so that's changes in just an atom in a million atoms entering the lake sediment. And if we look at the isotopes, which we haven't gotten into, the variability in the isotopes of, like, let's say lead, there's a bunch of stable isotopes. It's even more sensitive. We're talking about changes in the neutrons and the nucleuses and the ratios between natural forms of natural isotopes of lead. And so when we look at that, we have to remember, even if we can't imagine it impacting this lake in the mountain 10 kilometers from the site, that should be expected. You can't imagine it. Literally can't imagine it. It's too small. But as a scientist, I realize that's a strength, because that's a tool that we know the sensitivity of, and we can then look through it like a new window into the past and determine things that have happened. And the regionalness
Hmm.
of the lead signals in these lead records is consistent with what we see other places in the world, not just Western Europe, in China, Southeast Asia, with my colleague, the work of Aubrey Hillman. And then if we look over in Michigan and even in the Midwest, we see lead increases at Cahokia at 1100
Yeah.
AD. We don't see any increases in Keweenaw lead at 1100 AD. Well, the lakes in the Midwest are next to huge cities, and there's nothing up there in this shit. And yeah, and so even within the Midwest, even among Native American annealing and probably just very simple metalworking, like galena powder production, crushing cubes of galena into powder of galena, which is a lead ore. They find tons of it in the Midwest. That contaminated lakes, and the powder itself went into the lake and was washed off, and other things like that. So more emphasis on regional scale. We're going to be able to find these such small sites. Once we find a basin, the instrumentation will get us down to levels of variability that are going to be hard for or impossible for us to imagine. But it's really going to be opening up Pandora's box.
Yeah.
Our past, and this is not a bad thing. I'm not trying to like degrade anyone, but it's been relegated to understanding artifacts in bones. Right now, with the advent of the sediment core research, which lead is one thing, but now with DNA, fecal stanols, this is going to be like a parallel window that's just going to keep growing, and it's going to complement the artifact record, but it's going to maybe contradict it in a lot of places. But it's going to give us more high temporal resolution because you can analyze layers and give us more information, whereas archaeological sites are kind of disparate, disconnected, not continuous through time. So it's hard to generate time series. You can piece together settlements here and there and the times, and they overlap in the radiocarbon. But having those time series like we get in the ice cores and the peat records, I think they're powerful. I think they're little time machines. That's what I tell people in class. I'm like, they're little time machines. This is about as close as you're going to get right now to seeing, you get one little line that you get to watch through time. And that tells you what's
Right.
happening.
And what's really interesting to me, right, is like you have, like you said, like these like small amounts, right, like that are nothing for the lake, but they impact people, right? It's important to think about that the small amounts also impact people, even though it's like it's technically a glimpse in, in the lakes, but it's like it still impacts because it impacts the hormonal, even if it's not like, let's say, health, like visibly health, but it's like it impacts like hormones, it impacts digestion and all this kind of stuff, and you wouldn't even know.
I think even in North America, the skeletal remains actually have increased amounts of lead, even during like the annealing metalworking that we see here. It wasn't even full on smelting. So it complements, it tells us that, yeah, humans can be affected by this, it still be measurable. And the lakes are a complementary data set. And today, this work led to the recognition that heavy metals have been an issue in the modern environment. And regulations recently have brought that down. I talk about this on the channel with my colleague Aubrey Hillman and her student Skylar Hooler. They analyze lake sediments from upstate New York. And they find that the metals after 1970, heavy metals have declined and they're almost back to natural levels in some of these lakes. And that is translating into real public health benefits, real reductions in people's lead in their teeth. And so there's no way we can, when you hear people saying these environmental regulations are a waste of money, they don't have any benefit, you can point to the fact that the lead in our bodies have declined drastically since 1970, especially in children. And this is probably going to change history. Other things we've noticed with the last 20, 30 years is that violent crime has decreased. And this is a whole side research that's been done. Rick Nevin has looked at violent crime and its association with lead concentration in kindergarten and preschool age children. And there's this 20-year lag when you're really exposed to lead as a child. You tend to be dumber, more violent, more impulsive as an adult. And that seems to translate into higher crimes. And it works when you even looked at city by city basis. He looked at cities that were lead smelters were in versus not. And he found that there's a correlation between violent crime around smelters in these industrial cities. One place where there's a lot of heavy metals, a lot of smelting historically, East St. Louis. in St. Louis, historically among some of the most violent places in America, and it's right by the lead belt. So this is all really important stuff to tie in with public health as well. And that's where your work is coming in, at least in the past. I'm excited to see your dissertation come to fruition in these upcoming papers. Maybe you can tell us of what to look out for. I'm really interested in seeing your old stuff compared to your Bronze Age stuff. So to maybe sign out, tell us what to keep an eye out for. And when do you anticipate your defense, if you have one? Because then we can keep an eye out for your dissertation.
So the future work, so I have currently 4 papers in the pipeline. Some of it is going to be basically protocols and how the whole work has been developed with all of the experiments that I've done that led me to the work that I recently published. But in terms of the dissertation, sometimes, hopefully early next year, that's kind of the dissertation defense. I'm really hoping that in the future I'll be able to continue with this kind of work, because I think at this point I only scratched the surface of like what is possible. Because as you said, I think, you know, one thing that's in your, to tie with your previous comment, we always forget that human bodies are insanely flexible and adaptable, right? And by making changes in the environment, it can drastically change the quality of life of people. It's like just not like just in the past, but also like today, right? And you know, thinking that everything is so related, like like we're not existing in a vacuum, right? It's like everything is connected and interdependent. And I think this is what also shows in my work, that people, like, nothing exists in a vacuum. Everything is connected. How people do metallurgy, when do they do it, how it impacts animals, how it impacts them, how this changes through time. And fast forward to today, of like how, like you said, like changes in terms of regulations of bringing lead levels down, how this single act has impacts through time, through communities, how it can change, you know, whole populations, right? So these things are not to discard. It's worth like worth taking a note that these are important changes that can benefit everything and everyone. And while we might not be able to bring, you know, things to zero, reducing for the benefit of communities and for ours, really, in the end of it. So because even once we are gone, Earth is still going to be here, right? So there is a lot of like different studies, like for example, done after what happens in wars, right? Like once like a bomb explodes, there is a beautiful book named, like the book name, it's disaster, like when nature takes over. And it's beautiful to see as like the type of plants that adapt, right? Because we also have plants that like suck the contamination out. Like there are different types of mosses that grow only in contaminated environments. So again, people and nature is all adaptable, but like it needs like a little push, a little help, right? So, and I think that's what is really, it's interesting. And I think as scientists, we can really contribute to the expanding the knowledge of how it impacts, when it starts, and how we can mitigate, we can change, and how we can help developing maybe like even protocols of like how we can all help, how we can all work together on creating a better future. Really, it sounds idealistic, but there is an opportunity there.
So I don't get to see too many people, but if I do make it to the mainland, it'll probably be for a meeting. It'll probably be for like an AGU or a GSA. And I know you go to AGU sometimes, right? Have you been? No?
Not yet. Hopefully in the future.
Okay. Well, hopefully in the future, we'll see you at AGU. Thank you so much for joining me. Bye, everyone. Hello, everyone. I want to take a moment to remind you to please subscribe to this channel if you have not already, or like the video, or if that doesn't work, please leave me a comment below. Give me a suggestion about who should be on the channel next. Let's grow science communication. Thank you.